Today we're going to look at the Path of Digestion, which is the second video in the Digestive System PowerPoint. The idea of this one is that, or the second half of this PowerPoint, is that we're going to be looking at the path that food will go down when you start to eat it. So this is following through the entire digestive system. We're going to go through all the different organs and parts that you're going to need to know. So let's start. So obviously we start with digestion in the mouth. So, and truthfully, this starts before you even get to eat or drink and physically have that food in your mouth. It starts when you smell or you see the food, and it triggers a response, and that response is to make your mouth fill with saliva. Now, all the saliva in your body is produced in the salivary glands, and they're connected to your mouth via small ducts. Saliva actually contains three different things that we need to know. It contains amylase, lysosome, both are enzymes, and mucus. Amylase acts on starch. It breaks starch down to maltose. Lysosome is an enzyme that kills bacteria, so prevents harmful bacteria from getting through your digestive system. And lastly, mucus. Mucus is there just purely as a lubricant, and it helps the food go down your throat, helps it slide down there and get through down to the esophagus, which is where we're headed next, the esophagus. Now, we've got an animated GIF on the side here. I'm hoping you can see the mouse. And this is what's going to happen to food once it's passed through your throat, so you've swallowed, and it starts to make its way through the esophagus. And we'll talk about that picture in a minute. So firstly, swallowing is a reflex action. You can't control it, or you can choose not to swallow. But when you've got food in your mouth, you don't have to think, right, it's time to swallow now. It just naturally happens. It's a reflex. When your body does swallow, that's just your food being pushed down your pharynx by the back of your tongue. So it's this whole process of swallowing is your tongue pushing food down your pharynx. At the same time, your glottis is closed off. Now remember, that could be called the epiglottis. Doesn't matter which one. And that prevents food going down from your trachea, prevents it from going into your lungs. We'll look at that a bit more in detail later. If, perchance, the food does get past your glottis, then you have to cough and get it out of your trachea, because you don't want it in your lungs. That whole coughing and forcing the food up, or choking almost, is all because the food is irritating the sensitive epithelium in the trachea. It's only meant to have gas in there, not meant to have food, so instantly it irritates it and you have to try and get it out. Now, when food enters the esophagus, it's pushed down by muscle contractions. Now, this is a process called peristalsis. So, this is what's happening here. Now, this purple ball here, that's called the bolus. Okay, so that's the food going down your body, your esophagus. Now, you'll notice all of these along the entire esophagus here, there are muscles. Now, as the food gets to the next point, the muscles in front of it open up and the food can move through. The muscles behind it instantly contract and they're pushing the food through. So you've got this ball of food here and your esophagus is just opening to let it through, and then behind it squeezing to push it through. So it's these constant muscle contractions pushing the food down the esophagus. Okay, moving on from the esophagus, we go straight from the esophagus into the stomach. Now, the great thing with the stomach is the walls are really thick and muscular, and they contain close to 35 million gastric glands. Those gastric glands produce gastric fluid, which contains the enzyme pepsin, which breaks down protein into polypeptides. Now, pepsin works best under acidic conditions. Therefore, gastric fluid also contains hydrochloric acid, which makes the stomach conditions very acidic, makes pepsin work best. Bonus side effect, it also kills all the harmful bacteria that have gotten through the rest of your digestive system. Now, again, the stomach also secretes mucus, but this time it's not as a lubricant. It's to actually protect the walls of the stomach from acid, to prevent the stomach digesting itself. Food generally stays in your stomach for 3 to 4 hours, and in that time, the walls of the stomach, and we can see that in this image up here, are constantly contracting and churning the food, and that means it's pushing it around the entire stomach, trying to basically make sure that the food is pushed into a mushy liquid. Now, once we leave the stomach, we go to the small intestine. Between the stomach and the small intestine, and we can see it kind of in this picture here, just those 2 points there, there's a small ring of muscles that usually are kept shut. So usually the foods contained in the stomach can't leave the stomach. At certain times, they will open. And at those times, the stomach will contract and push the food all into the small intestine. Now, if the food is bad, so you don't want to take this food into your small intestine, you don't want to absorb the nutrients from food that's off, or it might have an infection or bacteria in it, then your stomach will churn and push the food the other way, back up your esophagus, down your throat. And that's vomiting. So, small intestine. Now, ironically, the small intestine is actually the largest part of the digestive system, despite the fact it's called the small intestine. It's around 6 meters in length. It contains a lot of enzymes, so it's got amylase, which is going to break down starch, trypsin, which is going to break down proteins, maltase, which is going to break down maltose into glucose, lipase, which turns fat into fatty acids, lipase turns fat into fatty acids and glycerol, peptidases, which are turning polypeptides into amino acids, and sucrase, which is breaking down sugar. Now, some of those enzymes are produced by the wall of the small intestine, and others are produced by the pancreas. The pancreas also produces a chemical called hydrogen carbonate. That neutralizes the acid from the stomach because your small intestine enzymes cannot work under acidic conditions. And everything that's coming from the stomach has had hydrochloric acid in it with the gastric juices, so it's highly acidic. So the first thing your intestines need to do is to neutralize that, making it a nice neutral pH so your small intestine can deal with it. That's the role of hydrogen carbonate. Now, it's important to know at the moment, we're going to move on to another slide. We're not actually leaving the small intestine. We're still looking at the small intestine. So, just a small gap, we're looking at the liver. So, first stop point here, we're still in the small intestine. We're just looking at the role that the liver has to help the small intestine. So, the liver produces a fluid called bile. Now, bile is stored in your gallbladder, and after you eat, it's squirted into the small intestine bit by bit. Bile contains something called bile salts. Bile salts act on fat. They break that fat into small droplets, and that's a process called emulsification. It increases the surface area of the fat, so lipase can act on it. So basically, liver produces bile. Bile is stored in your gallbladder. When you eat, it goes from the gallbladder into the small intestine. Bile contains bile salts. Bile salts break fat into small droplets. Therefore, it's a lot larger surface area, and lipase can act on it, breaking it down. Back to the small intestine. So now we're going to look at small intestine and the ability of the small intestine to absorb nutrients from the food you're eating and use them sufficiently in your body. That's done through a process called villi. Now, villi is this image over here, and you'll notice the villi almost look like small finger-like projections. The entire purpose of those is to increase the surface area of the small intestine. Now, the walls of your small intestine have very good blood supply. There's blood all around them. And every villi contains capillaries that once the food's digested, or once the food's absorbed through those villi, is transported immediately into the capillary into your blood. Now, the walls of your small intestine, again, contain muscle. Now, the point of those muscles is to squeeze the contents of the small intestine, making sure that they're constantly touching the walls, and every bit of nutrient that we want from them can touch the wall and be absorbed into the villi, into the blood. Now, every now and then, those muscles will also contract, and they'll push the food into the large intestine, which is where we're going now. Large intestine. So the large intestine is broken up into 3 parts. We've got the colon, the rectum, and the anus. Now, the first part of the large intestine is the colon. So basically, as the material moves along the large intestine, water is going to be absorbed, and therefore, as the water is being pulled out of whatever's left in your large intestine, it's becoming more solid. So we're getting more and more solid as we move along the colon. Eventually, this new solid matter moves into the rectum, where it's going to be stored as feces. Now, the lining of the rectum produces mucus. that mucus, again, like it was in the esophagus, is going to be used as a lubricant to move the feces through the rectum. Now, finally, the feces are ingested through the anus. That's a process that's triggered by build-up of pressure in the rectum. So the more feces that builds up, the more feces is pushed through to the anus. That's defecation. It normally takes around 24 to 48 hours from when food is eaten to get from your mouth to your anus. Just the last part here, almost the appendix of the digestive system, is the cecum and the appendix. Both of these are offshoots from the large intestine. Currently, they have no function in humans. In grass-eating mammals, they contain bacteria, or they do contain bacteria, which digest cellulose. So things like cows, the point of the cecum and the appendix is to produce bacteria which are going to digest that grass so they can eat the grass. Doesn't happen in humans anymore. What does happen, though, is sometimes harmful bacteria will get caught in our appendix. Now, because it's an offshoot from the large intestine, it doesn't constantly get flushed out. Therefore, those harmful bacteria can breed, multiply, and that causes severe inflammation, leads to appendicitis when you need to get your appendix removed.